Well, explosive news. The jury has spoken in the Chad Daybell case. Take it away, James.
The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the individuals interviewed or participating in this presentation and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster nor the Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the presentation should be considered innocent unless until found guilty in a court of law. This presentation contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener and viewer discretion is advised. And so we're going to give you an update on the Chad Daybell trial, and also at the same time remind you that CrimeCon starts today. Actually, registration is today, and it's going to be going on this weekend. And then if you want to see more podcasts, you can go to charliecrimebuster.com, or you can support us by going to the peacemakernetwork.com. That's where we support our first responders, law enforcement, and our brave men and women of the military. And since you are on the YouTube channel, we would like to invite you to press the subscribe button. It's just that simple. And the reason why I hurried through all that is because I want to hear more about this verdict. Wow.
Well, James, we're talking about the views and opinion. Well, the jury certainly had an opinion, and it was guilty on all counts right down the line. It's interesting. You and I had talked about this yesterday. We were scheduled to do this session last night.
Right.
But we thought, hey, the jury just might come in. We may have something else to talk about.
Exactly.
And sure enough, this afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, we had a verdict from the jury. Jury came back. Keep in mind, this is after like 7 weeks of testimony, roughly. 12 jurors. Well, they deliberated for about only 6 hours.
6 hours, yeah.
Yep, 6 hours. Guilty all the way around. That is guilty of murder of J.J. Vallow, Tylee Vallow, and Tammy Daybell. And also guilty on the conspiracy charges.
Right.
Yeah. So was it a surprise to you, James?
On all counts, yes. It was a surprise to me on all counts. Yeah, I'll be honest. Yeah, I was surprised. I thought that maybe he might get maybe a slap on the wrist when it comes to the two kids because he really didn't actually do the crime. And I thought first degree murder was probably just a little more, a little heavy on that, a little heavy handed on that part. But with Tammy, I think there was enough evidence that showed that he was in fact guilty of that crime. But I didn't see, I couldn't see the first two. I could see, a possibly manslaughter charge on JJ and Tylee, but I didn't suspect or even think about getting a first degree on a murder charge on the two children.
Well, I could understand you saying that, but you got to keep in mind that the jury's instructions was very clear that he did not have to have his hands in it, even if he counseled about it, even if he even talked about it to the point that he was conspiring. It was the same thing as being there. But you remember, James, we did a episode, I guess now several weeks ago, probably a couple months ago, one called the Gravediggers Digs His Own Grave.
Right. I remember that one.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, when it comes to that one verdict that you were a little shocked on, I wasn't shocked. And I believe the reason I wasn't shocked is Chad Daybell's own words is what really, I think, sunk him in front of this jury. And I thought one of the most moving parts of this was when the prosecution there and the rebuttal part and coming back at the last time there, I think that one scene of Chad Daybell, well, two things really. One was the phone call that he made to Lori on the day that they were out there on that property.
Right.
And if you remember, there was another phone call prior to that where they were talking about the plan, the contractor. Remember that?
Yeah, I do. Yes.
And if you remember, they were giggling through the whole thing. They were laughing like two junior highs in love, And she mentioned that thing about, well, we got a project and, digging up your backyard. And boy, I tell you, the cops are listening to that. They put that in hand with the fact of the GPS settings for Alex Cox and hearing about Lori and Chad talking about the backyard and the project. The very next day they were out there. And if you'll take the phone call that we heard played to the jury, and by the way, that was the first time I ever heard that phone call. Actually, the first time it ever been published was in this trial. And when you could hear them giggling and just having such a good time over the phone and laughing and all of that, if you could take that mood and compare it to the mood that was in the second phone call when he was talking to Lori in jail and the cops were out there digging in the backyard. Remember that call?
I do. Yes.
You remember how quiet and solemn it was?
Very.
You know, and then on the first call they were laughing and giggling, but little did they know that the cops would show up and that they were digging in the backyard. So to me, that says that both of them, Chad and Lori, both knew those kids were in that backyard. That's why, I mean, the wind was out of his sails. And then I think the other thing that really did him in was when he looked to his daughter while he was in that police car and he said these words, "I will not be back."
Exactly. He knew.
And he knew why he would not be back. He knew that those kids were buried in his backyard. And that puts him right in the conspiracy. And according to the law, you know, with a conspiracy to commit murder, it's just the same thing as if you committed murder. So they certainly threw the book to it, didn't they?
They did. 3 conspiracy charges, 3 first-degree murder charges, and 2 insurance fraud charges.
Yeah. You know, I was, do you remember? I don't remember how many, I know it was similar in Lori's trial. It did not take the jury very long. Do you recall how long it took the jury in Lori's trial?
I don't off the top of my head, no.
I do think it was similar in the fact that maybe they had a little more time on the day before, but they did come back, I think, in about 2 days and came up with that sentence. I think that this speaks very highly of the prosecution's case, that they certainly delivered it home to this jury, and they found a jury that was ready to move on the evidence. Let me ask you this. Do you think there's been a lot of people talking, James, about whether juries really take the time to really go through the evidence? Do you think that this is too quick for a jury to come back with a verdict?
No, I was really impressed with the prosecution in the way that she laid out a timeline and connected all the dots. I mean, there was enough evidence, digital evidence, as well as physical evidence to show where he was when the events occurred. So there was enough there to substantiate, you know, that he was in fact a mastermind behind most of what occurred.
Yeah,
his conversations with Alex, his conversations with Lori. Yeah, there was enough there.
And you know, the crazy thing, of course, about juries is you never really can predict them. But you know, I was wondering, all it would take was one person. And the thing that really concerned me and did surprise me a little bit of them coming back this quick was the fact that, if you remember, there were 2 lawyers were on that jury. And they talked about these 2 lawyers. Now, I don't think these attorneys were criminal lawyers, and they probably hadn't been around the criminal courtroom that much. But I could just see one of those lawyers saying, "Well, let's go through every piece of evidence." Well, if they did that, they would be out there deliberating for a week. I think they really came back on the first night, and I think they took the temperature and said, "How do y'all feel about this?" And I think they probably saw everybody was pretty well on the same page, and they said, "Well, let's break for tonight and let's come back tomorrow and let's solidify this and let's get this done." And I guess that's what they did. And you know, I cannot blame them, because keep in mind, it's not necessary for them to go over all that evidence, because they were sitting there listening as that evidence was presented.
Yeah, especially the 2 attorneys. And I thought it was kind of, I mean, one of the things that really kind of alarmed me was the fact that there was a question to the judge about something that was missing in their instructions that evidently the 2 lawyers pointed out.
Right. Yeah.
So it had to be, because I was like, I didn't know that the jury could request more instructions or clarification on instructions, you know? And so when I heard that, I was like, well, now, and then you disclosed that there were two attorneys. Well, that now it makes perfect sense as to why there was more instruction.
Oh, no doubt about that. Now, one thing, of course, what we usually do on this particular portion of our recordings and our podcasts is we talk about the previous podcasts. In the previous podcast, I talked about the fact that the family had come to testify for the defense. And we both know that the family was really very, very supportive of Chad.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought out the fact, and we asked our audience, we asked the people out there and on our crime train, we asked of the audience, do you think that these children, adult children, I should say, do you think that they were believed? Did they really believe what these children were saying? Because these adult children were saying, that she was ill, and according to the way that children testified, they really believed, or at least they led others to believe, that they believed that their mother had died of natural causes. In that poll that I mentioned, there was 5,000 people polled, and 95% did not believe the children. And I'm sure that the same thing happened with the jury, I guess, is that they did not really, and I think they probably thought like I did, is you can't really fault the kids because, they love their father. They've already had their mother taken from them.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and they now they're about to they're not going to see their father again as a free man. We know that, at least the very least he's going to get life in prison for the rest of his life,
Right.
maybe even the death penalty.
Right.
But as a family, I could see these children, they were already had all of this alternate reality that he had brainwashed them with, and I could see them in their mind justifying, for instance, saying, well, there was a night that Tammy was not feeling well, and she went to bed early, even right before dinner or right after dinner. I mean, sometimes I've had those days, haven't you?
Yeah, I've had that. Yeah, I have certainly
you
had them.
know, so
Yes.
I guess in their mind they could say that, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure there were times that she was bruised, and they could say that. So, I don't think that the kids really went out to lie and to deceive. I believe that this is what their own defense mechanism in their life for survival and wanting to have their father. I think that they came to justify that through that. Well, how do you feel about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that was, I didn't think that they did all that well on cross, um, especially when the prosecution was questioning Garth's credibility. That was one of the issues that came up. And so when you discount, the responses of the kids, and then the prosecution points out the fact that they said one thing to one person, but yet in court they said something else.
Right.
So it ruins their credibility. But how do you think the son-in-law did on the stand?
Well, I think Joseph did extremely well. I think he was probably one of the best witnesses that he had, and this just by his demeanor. Two things. Number one, his demeanor. I thought that he stood very strong against cross examination. The second thing was
Yeah, he did.
that people could say, well, this is not the son, this is the son-in-law, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how son-in-laws are. So he probably had a little more credibility with that. I really think that one of the reasons that this was sealed, I think that the prosecution did a really superb job of bringing back these rebuttal witnesses, and it was almost like any of the defense that Pryor had set up. They brought these rebuttal witnesses in, and it just knocked down each piece of evidence one by one. So I think that was really brilliant upon the part of the prosecution to bring some really, I think, really strong and effective rebuttal witnesses.
Well, how do you think the experts that the defense called, how do you think they did?
I think they did the best they could with what they had. But I think it was very, very apparent to me that if you took the experts that the Pryor had and compare them to the experts that the prosecution had, they were they were very, very much stronger than what Pryor had. I mean, the one expert who was saying that the death was undetermined,
Uh-huh.
she didn't look at very much at all, just a few documents, and she didn't even look at the medical history of Tammy. And you would think that someone who's coming to testify in behalf of the defense would at least take the time to study the medical records. She didn't even look at the medical records. But on the other hand, I tell you, my star witness, if you were to say, hey, who's your star witness? I would have to say, other than Chad and Lori against themselves, because their own word something.
Right.
But I would think Dr. Christensen. I thought he was just superb.
He was stellar. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I think. I mean, he held up well on cross.
He did.
He was very knowledgeable. He had taken the time to go through a ton of information, and I think that probably did more to convince the jury about Tammy's death not being natural than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't think we'll ever know. And we all are curious people, and I'd love to know. I don't think we'll ever know what Chad personally did in all of this. I mean, I know he was a part of the conspiracy. I believe he guided it. I believe if he had never come up with this death percentage and this light and dark and this sort of thing, I think that there's a good chance that these lives would still be alive. So I certainly believe he's guilty, and I would have voted just like the jury did. But how much of a hand do you think he had in any of this? As far as I call it, well, the mob calls it wet work. That the killing itself. And we know that Alex was the spiritual hitman, but what do you see Chad's part in the wet work? I guess is what I would say. How do you feel about that?
Well, since you kind of referred to the mob, I would say he was the mob boss. He was the visionary, calling the shots.
Oh, no doubt about that. I guess the thing that lingers in my mind, I don't know that he was out there. I believe Chad did all the real dirty work, and I believe that's why that he was actually caught. He did not go to Hawaii. He stayed back. He attempted to shoot Tammy in the driveway. His gun misfired. I believe he came back that night. I believe he was involved in the murder of Tammy that night. But as Dr. Christensen said, there's a good possibility that someone was holding her down while somebody else was smothering her. Mm-hmm. There were only two people there that night that we know of for sure, and that was Chad, and I believe Alex was there. So, it's hard to imagine that this man who married this woman, who bore his children, and they had such a good, strong family up to the point that Lori Vallow came into the picture. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine that he would look Tammy in the eye and participate in her murder, but I think there's a good possibility that he did.
It's interesting. You should point out the fact that Alex was probably part of the crime in killing Tammy, is because one of the things that the prosecution pointed out is that on direct, on the witness stand, on direct, Pryor asked him the question, where were you? He said, I was, his dad called to him, and he said that he heard a thump. His dad called to him, called him into the room, found his mother dead in the bed. But yet the prosecution pointed out the fact that he had shared with another family member that he came home and found his mother dead, and his dad was gone.
Yeah, that was actually McKay was his friend who he worked with at that haunted house. Mm-hmm. And he told McKay, he said I came home and found her on the couch and said she was pale and her lips were blue, and I could not find my father. So, at this point, I believe that perhaps Chad was involved in getting Alex from the house back to his car there at that church 2 miles away, because, it was just like an hour and something other minutes window. Mm-hmm. When we know that Chad was, or not Chad, but Alex was unaccounted for. Yep. His his device was left with his car there at that church. That's 2 miles away. That's a pretty good way to hoof it walking. So I think there's a good possibility that Chad came, found him, brought him there, and took him back to his car.
7 minutes.
Certainly,
Yeah,
yeah,
7 minutes by car. Yeah.
yeah. And then you and I were talking because you and I both have full-time jobs. We don't just do this for full time.
Exactly.
So we're doing this on the side, so we didn't have time to watch all of it or hear every single thing. Although I certainly have researched a lot of it, but I was having a problem figuring out in my mind why they were talking about that nook, in the home that they had. And now I know that there was actually an upstairs there. So it would have been very easy for Chad to bring him back through the back door there into that upstairs nook and then back into the house.
Right. Right.
And so I certainly know now why the prosecution was doing their best to get in the fact that there was a nook there and upstairs there. And, either Chad was upstairs sleeping and they had separate bedrooms, or Chad was helping Alex get away from the scene. One or the other, I think, happened on that terrible night that she died.
Right. You mentioned in the podcast that the GPS and the DNA information was not that critical in the trial. What did you mean by that? Because usually the critical information in a trial is the DNA evidence.
Yes, it is. It certainly is. And in this particular case, there was no DNA of Chad found anywhere at all. This is a case that was actually settled without any DNA. And that's very rare because, people are so used to, in the past, watching CSI, now watching all kinds of crime shows. And the DNA is mentioned so often that sometimes you think that if you do not prove DNA, then you don't have a case. But there was no DNA here, but that wasn't what the prosecution was building their case on. The prosecution was building their case on the words of Chad and the words of Lori, the texts, the phone calls, and a ton of witnesses that came down the line. Now, the GPS situation is even, I think, more interesting because we know that Chad actually researched on how to turn the GPS off. We know that his GPS was off. We know he had several burner phones, but the whole time that he was maneuvering in and between the scenes, his GPS would not reveal where he was. Kind of like with Brian Kohlberger when he turned his phone off during the time of the murder of the Idaho students.
Right.
But here's the crazy thing. The prosecution's trying to prove that because his GPS wasn't on, he wasn't there that day when Tylee and little JJ were buried. He wasn't there on the property, but yet Chad said he was on the property because he called his wife and he said, I shot a raccoon and I was out there burning the brush.
Right.
So it didn't have to have his GPS to say he was on the property because he himself said he was on the property.
Right.
Exactly. I thought that was very, very strange that they went to all that work to say he wasn't on the property when he actually, in his own phone call, stated that he was on the property.
So basically, he made a damning statement just by admitting that he was on the property.
Yeah, and and I just it blows my mind. But I've worked in law enforcement for a good while, and actually, as a chief deputy, we would oversee our corrections in my county that I was a chief deputy on. And I say it surprises me, but it really doesn't. Everybody knows. I mean, it's very, very clear that phone calls in the jail are recorded. The only time it's not is if it's attorney-client privilege.
Right.
And I cannot believe that they were so open in trying to speak in code. You would think that they would know somebody is listening and somebody's going to put this together.
Right. Right. You would think.
Yeah.
You would certainly think. Well, you mentioned that this reminded you of the Casey Anthony case. What was that all about?
Well, yeah, a biggie. I think a biggie. If you remember the Casey Anthony case, there was a lot of evidence And by the way, if you're listening and you're not familiar with the Casey Anthony case, what a case that is. And I would encourage you to go to charliecrimebuster.com. You can go to the Casey Anthony, just put that in the search bar. You find a lot of episodes we did on the Casey Anthony case. But in the Casey Anthony case, there was a whole lot of attention put toward the search for chloroform. And
Right.
actually, the prosecutor in that particular one, the prosecution alleged that the little girl was actually put to sleep by chloroform and maybe even killed by chloroform because there was a tape around her mouth and this sort of thing. Well, right toward the end of the trial, a blockbuster moment in the Casey Anthony trial was when her own mother, and remember, her own mother is the one who started this whole thing. She said, I haven't seen, my granddaughter,
Yep.
I
Right.
haven't seen little Kaylee, and she's the one that called the police.
Yep.
But as she realized that her daughter was facing the same penalty now that Chad is facing, she actually got up on the stand and she said, no, it wasn't Casey that searched for chloroform. I searched for chloroform on the computer. Well, in the same way, you remember the search for southwest winds
Right.
on the day before that the kids, one of the kids at least, was buried on the property.
Tylee. Yeah.
Yeah, Tylee. The day before that, there was a search for southwest wind. And so Emma gets up and says, hey, no, it was me. And it's hard for me to believe that. I don't believe her because, I mean, she lived in another house. Why would she go to her parents' house, get on the computer, and look up southwest wind?
Exactly.
It's much more believable that Chad was looking at that because he knew they were going to be burning a body the next day and wanted to make sure, the wind didn't take the smell and alert other people and that sort of thing,
Exactly.
So that's how it reminded me of Casey Anthony because, here her mom gets up and says, I searched for chloroform. Here the daughter gets up and says, no, it wasn't Dad. It was me that searched for southwest wind.
Right. Well, so now we have a guilty verdict. What do you think the sentencing is going to consist of? And that's tomorrow.
Well, yeah, the judge read the sentencing instructions to the jury and then, went ahead and sent them home for tomorrow. There's going to be some impact statements from people who have been impacted by this terrible, terrible tragedy, and that's going to happen tomorrow. Now, the interesting thing is there are 11 circumstances that actually needs to come to be. There's 11 ways that a death penalty can be warranted. One is with murder with especially heinous or cruel, a murder that is especially heinous or cruel. Another one is manifesting exceptional depravity. Number 3 is utter disregard for human life. And there's several others on it. But now get this, only one of these 11 things, if the jury believes one of these 11 things without a reasonable doubt, then the instruction says you can then vote for the death penalty. And there's no doubt in my mind that number 3, which says utter disregard for human life, I think that's a key one. And I also believe that especially heinous and cruel is another one.
Yeah.
So I think that the elements are there for them to go to the death penalty. I guess the real question is, do they have the courage to do it?
How much of an effect do you think the impact statements will have on the outcome?
Oh, I think it's going to be extremely emotional, and I think it's going to be. I think that's going to mean more than all this evidence put together, because I think this jury has been they've been there for so long, and they've had to hold it in, and they've had to look at evidence and facts and this sort of thing. And tomorrow, it's not going to be the facts; it's going to be the emotional punch. And I believe this jury is going to feel it. I believe they're going to feel it in every fiber of their being as they sit there and they hear these family members talk about how this has impacted their lives. And if anything is going to move them to the death penalty, I think that that'll do it. And they're going to have the justification because those circumstances, I believe, will be met. And if you were to ask me what I believe they're going to come back and they're going to give him the death penalty.
When do you think that will actually be carried out?
Oh, it's not going to be soon because there's going to be all kinds of appeals and years is going to take place. It's all of these death penalty. Even though you get the death penalty, there's all kinds of appeals that'll go through the court, all kinds of time because we want to make sure that we don't unjustly, put somebody to death. So I think it's going to be years. I'd say, 10 years or more before we'll see him come to the death penalty. If the jury decides that he gets it, and I believe he will. What do you think?
I think he'll get it, but I'm not sure about the timeline. I'm probably looking at maybe 7 to 10 years, maybe. But well, I'm thinking with the appeal process, it usually has to go through, the appellate court. And that's a question I have for you because I want to completely understand, and also for our listening audience, when there's an indigent individual who has no finances, he comes basically to the court with no money. So he's basically has no resources to be able to put up the money for an appeal. How can he still appeal if there's no money? Does the court apply? Does the court provide an attorney?
I could give you a really good answer on that one. You and I pay for it. The taxpayers, pay for it. Yeah. In fact, he'll get all kinds of really good legal expertise at no cost to him. And that's true in just about all of the death penalty cases, unfortunately. And that's why, people used to think erroneously. They thought, well, we need to send this guy to the death penalty because it's too expensive to keep them in prison for the rest of their life. Actually, statistics will tell us it costs more money to put somebody to death than it does to keep them in prison for the rest of their life. So it's actually it's actually cheaper if you talk about the financial cost of it is cheaper to put somebody in prison for the rest of their life than it is to send them to death. That's a lot of people don't understand that. It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is ironic. I mean, and kind of, elaborate on that because I'm trying to
get
my head around it.
Basically because of the appeals. They're going to have all kinds of experts come in. They're going to take up all kinds of time before the court. There's going to be all kinds of motions that are going to come before the court. Those motions have to be written out. There's going to be all kinds of tests that are done, whether he's sane or he's not sane. There are going to be psychiatrists, psychologists, there's going to be doctors, there's going to be medical. It's just going to be all kinds of expertise are going to come to do their very best to try to find some loophole somewhere where they can save his life, and they're going to it's going to cost a ton of money. And in addition to that, you're also footing the bill for keeping him in prison while he goes through all that. So it's going to be a very, very expensive. I haven't looked up the exact amount, but you can, if you're out there, you're listening, if you're interested in that, just go Google how much does it cost to keep somebody on death row, and you will be amazed at what you're going to see that comes back. Now, Idaho is a pretty conservative state, so it may move a little quicker in the state of Idaho than other cases. But you found out something the other day that if when they're ready to do that, if they do not have the means to put them to death by the needle or something like that, they can actually use a firing squad. Didn't that what you saw? Yeah.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Well, how long? I don't know. Here's the other thing that I think is going to be interesting. I heard the judge say today that he's going to let the jury decide this, but the jury could decide if they wanted to work on through the weekend. And if they did that, we may have this thing wrapped up, before even next week. So I think that's going to be interesting to see. I think if I was on the jury, They're going to be probably sequestered, through this. I imagine the same way they were in the deliberate or as they deliberated. I think that if I was on that jury, I'd want to work the weekend. I'd want to, hey, let's get this thing done and over with and get home.
Right.
Right.
Well, this was certainly an interesting show, and the fact that we've got a verdict and now we're going to put this to rest. So now that we have a verdict and possibly the sentencing phase tomorrow, what do you think you'll have for the podcast for this Sunday?
Well, what I wanted to do, and I thought about this, I was thinking about this earlier this week. I think this is a good time to go back and kind of review the trial. And I would like to, we're planning on presenting the next episode on the highlights of the trial. What were the things that really stood out, that really made the difference to this jury? And there's so many things, but there are a few things there that I think really moved the needle. And we're going to be sharing that in our next podcast. And of course, we'll also share that crazy crook story. So until next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, stay safe, stay alert. Yep, for the life you save, it could be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel using tag @CharlieCrimebuster. Even visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/CharlieCrimebuster. Or if you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.